This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, the world leader in unmanned aircraft systems and makers of the affordable, scalable, and autonomous new collaborative combat aircraft.
Jennifer Welch is the Chief Geoeconomics Analyst for Bloomberg Economics. She previously served as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. She also served as the Director for China and Taiwan on the U.S. National Security Council staff. She joins us today to talk about the relatively unknown but very important discipline of leadership analysis. We'll be right back with that discussion after a break. I'm Michael Morell, and this is Intelligence Matters.
America must not fall behind in air dominance. That's why we need the Collaborative Combat Aircraft by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems. These new unmanned combat jets are affordable, scalable, and autonomous, and they partner with traditional combat formations to let American and allied pilots see first and act first. Our next-generation jets will let Washington retake the numbers advantage in the skies. For Collaborative Combat Aircraft, rely on General Atomics Aeronautical, the world leader in unmanned aircraft systems. Learn more at UAV.com.
Jenny, welcome to Intelligence Matters. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're gonna talk about something called leadership analysis. And quite frankly, a couple of our listeners have sent us notes saying, hey, could you do a podcast on leadership analysis? So we said, sure. So we're going to do that today, and I'm really excited about that. But I want to give some background. I want to give some context to both analysis and to who you are, Jenny. So everybody has a how I got to CIA story. So that's the best place to start. So Jenny, what's yours?
Sure. So very early on in my career, I worked with someone who I think you know well, Chris Johnson. He was a senior China analyst at the agency for many, many years. Worked for him when he went to CSIS as the Freeman Chair in China Studies. And he was really the main reason, the main inspiration for me even attempting to join the agency for two reasons. One, as you know, he's just an incredibly impressive analyst and expert on China.
He's been on our show so many times.
Oh, yes. I think I've listened to all the episodes with him.
And he actually counts, right? How many times have I been on, and how many times does Michael's other frequent guest comes on, and he actually keeps track of that.
That true analyst, right? Yeah, he brings just such deep knowledge of China issues and is also just an incredibly strong communicator, incredibly strong writer. So I think is a really great ambassador representative for the kinds of skills you can build up at the agency. And there was also just a really, really supportive mentor and encouraged me to apply and then really stick through the process, which in some cases can be rather opaque and rather lengthy. Yeah. But was, a really strong mentor throughout that entire process. And I'm on the other side of it, just incredibly grateful for him and incredibly grateful that I stuck with it throughout.
Did you have a China background when you came?
Yes. So that was probably part of the reason it was a little bit longer for me. I had been a Fulbright scholar in China just beforehand, lived in China for a number of years with that and with language studies. And I think that's one of the reasons that they were interested in me. But it just lengthens the process a little bit when you have overseas experience.
Yeah, there's this tension, right, between the expertise you get and the ground truth and the cultural understanding and the language, right, you get from that, which the people who actually want to hire you, right, the people who do the analysis every day like that. But the security people, on the other hand, right, not so much. The people who have to clear you, not so much. So there's this creative tension that exists.
Definitely. But I will say again, for anyone who is thinking about it, it was well worth the process, well worth the wait. And it's going to be a little bit different than folks who are used to applying for jobs on the side in terms of the amount of communication and the time that it involves. But just stick with it. Again, well worth the wait.
Yeah. Okay. So we talk about CIA analysts all the time. We talk about CIA, analysis all the time. But I don't think a lot of people actually have a sense of what that actually means, right? So what does an analyst actually do?
So one of my colleagues used to joke, and it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but she essentially said, we read until they tell us to write, and then we write until they tell us to read again. Again, a little bit of an exaggeration and a painting of a broad brush, but I think it does tend to be a job that involves a lot of research, a lot of deep thinking about issues, debating of those issues with your colleagues, and then communicating your findings either through briefings or through written products. Where it goes from there, in terms of the details in the day to day, I think it can really depend on the area of focus. As someone who was focused on China, which I would consider or put in the category of more strategic analysis, great power competition, my day is going to look a little different, and my area of focus is going to look a little different from someone who is, say, supporting we call the war fighter, someone who is actively involved in, for example, a conflict zone. That might be a little bit more tactical analysis. It might be a little bit more of a rapid and rush day. So it can really depend. But I think, and then even within that, the disciplines are really broad. So you have political, military leadership, economic analysts. You also have analysts who are kind of more focused on how do we push forward the frontier of analysis and look at new qualitative and quantitative tools that we can do across these disciplines to engage in better analysis. So it's a really varied field. And I think that's what makes it really interesting, especially for an intellectually curious person. There's a lifetime of careers you can do in that job.
Yeah. So I always thought that one of the keys to really insightful analysis is the question that you're asking. So how did you come up with the questions that you worked on? Were they asked of you, right, by somebody at the White House or by the director or your boss, or did you come up with those yourself? If so, how did you do that? What does that look like in terms of I'm going to do analysis? What's the question I'm trying to answer here?
I think that's where, as you had noted before, there's sometimes a tension, right? There's a tension between what policymakers are asking for, what other customers are asking for, and obviously there's a need to provide them the answers there. But sometimes you as the analyst have a sense of, well, maybe that's not the right question to be asking, or maybe there's this other entirely different issue set that isn't, for example, what we would call current, isn't related to what the questions we're facing today, but is an important question to answer to be able to answer those questions in the future. And I think it's a juggling matter of being able to do the necessary and kind of answer the needful questions while still making sure that you're providing policymakers that additional value of here's the additional questions that you might also want to be asking, and here's our answers to them.
Yeah. I have a good friend, longtime CIA operations officer focused on the Soviet Union and Russia. And he sent me an email probably a year ago now. And what he was trying to do was understand Putin's mindset. And so what he did, the question he asked was, Putin lists 5 or 6 Russian philosophers that he says are important to him. So what my friend did was go and read all of those philosophers and then write this little essay about, okay, what could this tell us about Putin? That's a really interesting question, right? And if you got that paper at the NSC, you just wouldn't set it aside. That's one you'd actually read, right?
Absolutely. No, I think first of all, kudos to your friend, because that is some dedication to tradecraft there in terms of going through all of those ratings. But that's exactly right. I think to understand these leaders, it's really when you get a gem like that, like from Putin on what specifically he finds to be works of inspiration to him. Absolutely. That is hugely valuable to dive into yourself and better understand what is he getting out of this.
Yeah. Okay, before we jump to leadership analysis, one more question. What was your sense of how policymakers, how much impact your work had on policymakers?
So I had kind of the unique opportunity to see it from both sides, as both an analyst who is briefing and then providing products to policymakers. And then when I did a detail to the White House,
right.
Being a policymaker myself and leveraging those. I mean, I think, in the first position as an analyst, it was a really unique opportunity, especially with leadership analysis, to provide a different lens, a different way of thinking about these issues. when you think about it, all governments and other organizations are ultimately run by humans. And especially for key issues like China, understanding the humans that are at the center of it is really critical to understanding the kind of main policy issues or debates that are at stake. If you don't understand how Xi Jinping thinks about the world, in today's China, I think you're not understanding how China operates or how it will operate in the future. So being able to provide them that lens and a way of understanding this person who in many cases they might not have ever met before, I think helps illuminate that additional side of understanding the kind of key policy issues or countries that they were wrestling with. And then for me as a policymaker, it was just incredibly valuable. Obviously, I knew China and Taiwan really well when I went over to the White House, but I was also covering a lot of countries for the first time in the rest of the Indo-Pacific, AOR, when I was in the vice president's office that I wasn't as familiar with. And I really did have to rely on, in particular, leadership profiles and leadership analysis more broadly to better understand the leaders that my boss, the vice president, was going to be meeting with and help prepare them for those conversations.
So now we're talking, right, about what leadership analysis is and why you do it, the purpose, right? How do you do it? How do you understand, the mindset of a leader and then what that means for their decision making?
That is a great question. And I think it's one that someone, if they're really dedicated to this discipline, would take a lifetime or at least a career lifetime to answer, right? I felt as a leadership analyst, I was constantly learning from my colleagues, not just other leadership analysts who cover China, but really across the world, because it is such a unique discipline and in some ways more of an art than a science. One of the things that we do that you mentioned your friend had done was look at the kinds of sources and interests that the leaders we cover are interested in. And that in itself can be a huge body of work, just trying to understand what are the artists that they're reading or what are the art forms that they grew up with? Who are the people that they've surrounded themselves with or looked up to over the course of their lifetime? Understanding their personal history. Where did they come from? What was their family dynamic like? Who are the people they surround themselves with and how do they tend to interact with other people? That tells you a lot about their worldview and the kind of values that they have and priorities that they have. Then there's looking through the entire body of literature on statements that they've made, how they've interacted with other American policymakers in the past, and gleaning insights from that about not just where do they stand on particular issues, but how do they operate in these settings? So it can really be a lifelong process of studying someone because people aren't static either, especially if you're studying a leader like Xi Jinping or Putin who has been in the game for a long time. There's a lot of history to go back to, but they're still in the game. So they're going to be constantly changing and evolving too, and you're going to need to keep up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you actually interviewing people who have met the person that you're focused on?
In an ideal world, yes. You're interviewing, for example, American diplomats or other policymakers who have met with these people, gaining insights from those interactions. And again, the challenge here is there's that kind of qualitative or non-concrete aspect to these conversations. For example, there's note takers who are taking down notes on what was said in the meeting, but that's also important how it was said. What was the body posture? What was sort of the facial reactions to some of these things? Getting a sense of someone's personality that oftentimes isn't going to be captured in formal ways, but is really important to a leadership analyst, and trying to distill that down into who someone is so that they can provide that to the next set of policymakers or diplomats who are going to be meeting with them.
Yeah, one of the things I tried to do, because I would meet with senior officials from other countries, sometimes overseas, but a lot of times, here in Washington, and I would invite the leadership analyst who was covering that person to sit in on my meeting, right? The guest had no idea that person was, the analyst who covers them, but I thought it was invaluable for the analyst to actually see that person, in action.
That is incredibly thoughtful of you, and also, incredibly generous thing to do for the sake of the analysis. And I'm sure for those analysts, it's like a lifelong dream come true to be able to meet the person that you spend day in and day out trying to understand. It's a really powerful experience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things, Jennifer, that we talk about on this show a lot is intellectual humility. right? Being aware of what you don't know, right? And if you're analyzing the latest Chinese advanced fighter, right? I mean, it's actually physics, right, and engineering. Trying to understand a foreign leader and where they're coming from, how they think about things, what framed those, where they're likely to go, that's hard. That's hard. So is thinking about what you don't know and thinking about how challenging this is that part of the job?
I think that's an incredibly important point. I mean, even for people we know really well in our personal lives, we sometimes misinterpret what they're doing or don't predict accurately how they're going to behave in a situation. It becomes even more difficult when you're dealing with a leader who you've mostly studied from afar and might only get kind of a sliver into their perspective. So I think that humility is really important. And the way I would frame it is, as leadership analysts, more broadly as analysts, right? No one has a crystal ball. We can't predict with 100% accuracy what's going to happen. Or if we could, then we're not answering really the important questions that are out there. We deal with a lot of uncertainty, especially when it comes to human beings, which can be incredibly unpredictable. But I think that humility is important in how we can still provide value in trying to distill for someone. Here is the history of this person, how they have tended to view the world. Based on that, this is how we think that they would operate in this situation, to at least provide some context, some framework for anticipating their moves going forward.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you saw this this piece in the Financial Times that said that Xi's mindset, right, about Taiwan is that we're trying to goad him into war, right, so that we could destroy his military, right? That's the last thing, right, that an analyst would think, right? But when you actually hear the person talk, particularly in private, you're like, wow, where did that come from? That's a lesson in that intellectual humility.
Absolutely. And I think that's also a really good example and a really good lesson, especially for those of us here in Washington, D.C., is we can sometimes, sort of do a little bit of mirroring and bias about how someone from a very different background, a very different strategic culture might think about the world. And that was, actually one of the most important lessons I took away, not just from China analysis, but also working on China at the White House, is that potential for misunderstanding. And it sounds so basic, but I think it's hard to underestimate the kind of deep levels of misunderstanding and sometimes bordering on paranoia that policymakers in Beijing have towards the United States. And it can go the other way too. But it's those sorts of things that sometimes we take for granted. And as a result, we don't address those misperceptions. And that can lead to really calamitous outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, Iraq and the United States during Saddam's quarter century in power is a great example. Complete misunderstanding on both sides. Result is, was two major wars, right? One started by them and one started by us.
Absolutely.
And we weren't talking, right? We weren't talking to them. We didn't have diplomatic presence. There wasn't communication. Analysts didn't have, a lot of information. And so that understanding of where the other person is coming from and making sure they're understanding where you're coming from, it works both ways, right, is critically important.
Absolutely.
So this discipline of leadership analysis is really central. People talk about, political analysis and military analysis and economic analysis, but the leadership piece is what brings all of this together, right, and makes it relevant for policymakers, it seems to me.
I mean, I'm biased as a former leadership analyst, but I think that's true. I think it's also incredibly valuable considering that we're operating in the world of international relations, of diplomacy, of strategic competition. The interlocutor might not be candid with you about how they're viewing things, especially if you're dealing with some, particular diplomatic circles where they have very standard language that they have to use. You might not be getting an accurate reflection of how the system actually thinks about things. And having the ability to kind of tease out the reality there, I think, is really valuable to getting a better and more accurate appreciation for where this country and where this leader is coming from.
Yeah. So your time at the White House, did you get a sense of how much the policymakers valued leadership analysis? Did you actually see that in action?
Absolutely. I think for every policymaker, there's going to be a slightly different focus, but
Sure.
I think across the board, everyone I saw, regardless of kind of what issue area or country they were working on, use leadership analysis because at the very, very least, you would need those leadership profiles before going into a conversation with the foreign leader. So even for folks who perhaps weren't reading as much of their other material as others, what everyone seemed to always make sure that they did was read the leadership profile before
Yeah.
they talked to a foreign leader. It was in every single, sort of prep book. It was in every single, person's queue whenever they were engaging in this diplomacy, which is a frequent part of the job.
Yeah.
So yes, I would say it was probably the most commonly used product.
Yeah. One more question, then we're going to take a deep dive into leadership profiles. And the question is analysis of the psychology of a leader or analysis of their mental health. Is that something that a leadership analyst does, or is that something that other folks do?
So in my experience, most leadership analysts don't necessarily have the training to do that on their own. And for me, I worked with a trained psychologist who I think you also had
Yes.
on a previous
Yes.
episode of the
Yes.
show, Ursula Wilder,
Yeah.
who was just an incredible partner in the work that we did together. I learned so much from her, and she really brings, from her leadership analyst perspective, a very complementary but very unique and useful toolkit to bear, which is the ability to kind of look across leaders, look across personalities, and identify these key traits that are going to help us better understand this person. And even if we haven't seen them operate in a particular situation, anticipate how they might. So for example, if she identifies someone as having narcissistic or paranoid tendencies, maybe we haven't seen how this particular leader has operated in a situation, but we know how people with those same tendencies have operated, and that's incredibly valuable. I think the other thing is I just have tremendous admiration for her and her discipline because, for most psychologists or mental health experts, they have an opportunity to directly interview or interact with their subjects, but she's oftentimes watching them from afar. And that's just a much more difficult thing to do. But she brings a lot of rigor and a lot of experience to that analysis that, again, just incredibly valuable to a leadership analyst.
We're talking with former CIA analyst Jennifer Welch. We'll be back after a break.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Okay, leadership profiles, and my experience is exactly yours, right? About their value. My experience tells me that if policymakers actually had to open up their wallet and pay for CIA analysis, leadership profiles are the only thing they'd pay for. They would actually open up and give you $20 for a leadership profile. They're that valuable. So what are they? There's a format, right? There's a formula to them. Talk about that.
Yeah, there is a very specific structure, which I think has evolved over time based on lessons learned. And it's an attempt to kind of balance between what's needed to cover specific issues, specific leaders, with having a format that is useful across countries, across leaders, to make sure we're providing all policymakers the kind of key fundamental pieces of information across all these leaders. But generally speaking, what these profiles are going to include are things like the leader's personal and professional history, an overview of kind of key positions or actions that they have taken that tell us something about who they are. It also often has some facts about their personal lives, their family, their hobbies, their interests. those might not seem very policy relevant, but it's actually really helpful to someone who's going to be meeting with them to know some information to help connect with this person on kind of a human level. And then, there's the one of the hardest parts of the leadership profile to get right is how do you distill a lifetime of experiences and all this data that you've gathered about someone into, a kind of judgment or a conclusion about who they are and kind of the key. If you were walking into a blind date with someone, here's like the 3 things you need to know about who they are.
So Jennifer, I was a little skeptical of the value of the personal nuggets until I was actually starting to meet with foreign officials. And I'd have these leadership profiles, and I saw just how valuable it was, because you want to have a personal connection, right? And you want to find something that you have in common, kids or books or sports or something. You want to find something in common so you can build on that, and that's it's absolutely invaluable for that. So when I was a first line supervisor, one of my analysts did a leadership profile on a foreign leader that went to the then vice president, George Bush. And he actually sent it back with a note on it that says, because the leadership profile said he enjoyed tennis. So the note that came back was, I've played tennis with him. He's good tennis player, strong at the net, weak backhand. Isn't that great?
That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's invaluable, right? Okay, so that's the structure. Why is it formulaic?
I think it's again that tension of trying to design a product that's going to be useful and utilized by leadership analysts who are covering a really wide variety of leaders. It's not just, for example, China analysts who are covering people like Xi Jinping. You have leadership analysts for almost every country, plus, or other organizations that don't maybe neatly fit into the sort of schematic that we would use for government leaders. And you have within that set of leadership very different personalities. And I think it's an effort to try and create some coherency across all of these profiles to make sure the kind of key foundational pieces of information are being included for policymakers, regardless of who they're meeting with. I think the other piece of this is, again, leadership analysis can sometimes be a little bit more art than science. It's, I think, more than other disciplines, really kind of qualitative and potentially subjective. For example, you're doing military analysis, you can look at weapon stocks to try and determine which country has, a leg up in a military sense. If you're looking at economic issues, you can look at GDP figures. When you're looking at someone's life, their actions, their statements, you're drawing conclusions about who they are. And that can be a very subjective exercise. So I think this is an attempt to try and structure that in a way that make sure we're still providing really rigorous analysis.
Yeah. So these leadership profiles are living documents, right? You do one, somebody's going to meet with them, you give it to them, right? A month later, somebody else, you give it to them. How do you think about when it's time to update them?
Yes, they are definitely living documents, and the best leadership analysts will be constantly revising them, especially for really key leaders who are, for example, either we're always getting questions about or they're having a lot of interactions. You want to be incorporating feedback from people who have used the leadership profiles and met with this person to continuously update it. You want to be incorporating more recent events into it. You want to be incorporating life changes that person has gone through. So I would say it depends a little bit on sort of those 2 factors of, what is the profile of this leader? How much are they interacting with others? And have there been any sort of major developments that require an update? But for some leaders, it might be you're updating it on almost a monthly basis. And for some leaders, it might be more every year or so, kind of depending on how much frequency of changes are happening in their life. If they've just moved to a new job, for example, you'd want to update it based on that.
Yeah. It just occurred to me that when Bush 41 was president, in the PDB, every Friday, we would put, here's what's going on with key people around the world. And so it might be, I'm just making this up, it might be a chancellor of Germany, right? And it might say that his daughter just had her first baby, right? That kind of stuff. And he would actually then pick up the phone and call the chancellor to congratulate him, right? So this stuff is incredibly useful. But he was such a huge consumer of that kind of thing.
Well, and I think for policymakers, especially, the commander in chief, someone at that level, that kind of information is essential. These are your counterparts. These are people that you're engaged in high stakes negotiations with. And that kind of personal diplomacy can sometimes make or break your progress on those issues.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Jennifer, your favorite leader that you looked at?
So I think there's two ways to answer that question. There's my favorite leader in the sense that it's someone I kind of look up to and admire, and then and then it will become very obvious why I'm drawing this distinction. And then there's the leader who is kind of most interesting to cover, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to do it.
The first category, the leader that I probably had the just found really fascinating cover and really admired in a positive sense is Tsai Ing-wen, who was previously the president of Taiwan, just recently handed the baton over to her former vice president, Lai Ching-te. And she was really a great person to cover from the perspective of just being a fascinating leader of a democracy, someone who rose from being a technocrat and not someone you would think of as a traditional politician to what I would characterize as a very effective leader. And watching kind of her evolution over time was really fascinating. And also, as someone who, covered both China and Taiwan, sometimes China wasn't always the happiest story to cover. So it was nice to be able to cover a democracy. And so I would say Tsai Ing-wen was probably my favorite in that respect. And then my favorite from a more just a fascinating character study would be Xi Jinping. I could speak at length about, how interesting of a character he is. I think in completely different reasons. He was also probably far more difficult to study because China is just a much more opaque society. There, it was a lot harder to get information about him, whereas Taiwan is an open democracy with a very, active, great press. But he's been a very interesting person to continue to watch.
Yeah. What makes him so interesting?
I mean, I think it's everything from, for example, when he was rising to power, I think there was a common understanding of him, including within China, that really didn't understand his personality. And so he has too had an evolution, but I think it's less so that he himself has changed so much as he has been able to show more of who he really is to the world. Many thought of him before he rose to power as being somewhat of a blank slate, not particularly ideological. I think a lot of even members of the party may have underestimated his ambition and his ability to act on that ambition. And he has obviously since then really proven himself to be incredibly effective, also incredibly driven, sees himself as a transformative leader. I think the other thing that makes Xi Jinping really fascinating, and again, perhaps this is because I come from a very different background, but he has just a very different way of looking at the world than I think a lot of certainly American leaders do. And teasing out why that is, his personal history, how he thinks, the sort of strategic culture that he operates in, I think is a really fascinating and interesting exercise because it is so different, but also incredibly important to anticipating, especially as he's consolidated power in China, what Beijing's going to do going forward. Really at the center of that question is, what does Xi Jinping think about this?
Yeah. Does he have a human side?
I think he has.
He seems so, he seems so rigid and focused and, he's got to have some humanity, right?
I think he definitely has some humanity to him. I think everybody does.
Right.
I think he has had to, for his personal survival, he grew up during the Cultural Revolution, was a sent down youth. He was a firsthand witness to his family's persecution through that. And I think he learned very early on to be careful about how much he shows of himself to the world, right? He has this great quote about human relationships are really fickle. And I think that says a lot about how he genuinely thinks about the world. And you look at how that translated into his political career again, where he was very careful about kind of presenting a version of himself that everyone could like and get on board with, and kind of to borrow a Deng Xiaoping aphorism, right? Like a little bit of, hide your strength a little bit, bide your time, sort of, take folks by surprise when you reveal your true colors is I think was also a key part of his political survival and his political rise. And I think that's something he kind of carries with him still.
Yeah. What was your reaction to the Financial Times article that we talked about earlier, right? That, that he may think that we're trying to goad him into war in Taiwan. What was your reaction to that?
I had two thoughts on it, which aren't mutually exclusive. I think the first one is he was talking to a foreign leader. I believe it was a European leader at the time, and it was shortly after, Tsai Ing-wen had been transiting the United States. And I think part of it was an attempt to influence, perhaps, to relay to this other leader, we're not the problem here. The United States is the problem. We're not the ones creating issues here. But
so that would be a diplomatic talking point.
A little bit. I think it probably served that purpose. But I also think there is a genuine reflection of concern there. I mean, I can talk in great detail about the history of U.S., China, Taiwan, and cross-strait issues, but there has been this long-running factor of Beijing considering what role Washington is trying to play in the Taiwan Strait, and whether we are playing a role of stabilizing the situation and maintaining the status quo, or whether we're emboldening trends in Taiwan that Beijing finds very concerning. And I think one of the trends of late has been that Beijing is worried we're increasingly in that latter camp of emboldening trends, and that this is part of a broader gambit to try and contain China using Taiwan. So I think both of these things can be true. I think he might have said it in part to kind of shift the blame, but it was probably also a reflection of some genuine concern that we've seen building in Beijing over the last few years.
Yeah. Maybe the place to end it here is to say, Jennifer, that these leadership profiles are such an important part of what the CIA does, that oftentimes when CIA officers change jobs or leave the agency, people will write a mock leadership profile of that person. So I've had that done to me a couple of times, and they weren't flattering. But they can be really fun, right? They can be really fun. That's how big of a part of the culture they are.
Absolutely. And I've had the opportunity to witness some of the just amazing leadership profiles that could never get through editors, by the way. But I think that, these are like the sort of the color, the sharp wit that leadership analysts often want to use in these profiles and can't get through formal products. So they use a little bit on their colleagues. But you're absolutely right. I think it's one of the best takeaways that you can have if you leave a job is to have a leadership profile that's doing a little bit of healthy ribbing.
Yeah, I told the agency, keep those classified, the ones that they wrote about me, keep them classified. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to send Chris Johnson a note and tell him Jenny's at 1 and she's catching up with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. That was former CIA analyst Jennifer Welch. I'm Michael Morell. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.